Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? And hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to the course, I thought that I would give my little Fabio Wardley versus Daniel Dubois fight breakdown. And this is going to be my final fight analysis, my final fight breakdown, and my final fight prediction. Now, this is going to be a very interesting fight. And for those of you, like my man Saint Don, in the comment section, for those of you that may have not been entertained by last weekend's fights, especially that of the Naoya Inoue versus Junto Nakatani fight. Although I thought that that fight was a very great fight, at least just in terms of showing what Mr. Naoya Inoue could do in terms of his technical mastery within a multitude of ways that he could fight, especially over a very highly skilled and dangerous opponent and someone that looked to be at least a weight class bigger than him. But that being stated, for those of you that did not think that that fight did not, live up to the hype, or for those of you that think that it didn't live up to the hype, this fight, at least more than likely, very well should. And of course, for those of you that do not know the fight that will be occurring, it will be that of the undefeated heavyweight contender. I believe the number one undefeated heavyweight contender in the world right now, Mr. Fabio Wardley, who I believe is the current IBF champion of the world, or actually, excuse me, the WBO World Heavyweight Championship of the world. And of course, you also have that Mr. Daniel Dubois, who was the former heavyweight champion of the world, who was the former IBF champion of the world. And this is going to be a very interesting fight. It is between debatably the two best British contenders within that of the whole entire weight class. Now, of course, certain people may debate, about Tyson Fury or maybe some other guys, but with Tyson Fury, being a little bit aged out, and with him, I'm not really quite sure where he's going to go next. I would have to claim that these two guys, at least at the moment, are the two best British contenders in that of the heavyweight division. And the reason why this fight is so very particularly interesting is because although Fabio Wardley more than likely is going to be the slight favorite heading into this fight, this truly is a fight that a lot of people, including myself, believe could truly go either way. Now, I'm going to break down, in my view, what both fighters' strengths and weaknesses are, and who I believe more than likely is going to win the fight. And when you predict a boxing fight, it can be at times a little bit difficult, not always, but this is one of those fights that is especially kind of difficult to predict because when you talk about boxing, you can't just talk about the skill set. You can't even just only talk about the skill set and also the physicality or the athleticism of both fighters. You also have to talk about that of the mentality and maybe at what point they're going to be at mentally coming into this fight. Because a lot of the time, self belief and confidence, and one fighter overall being a little bit mentally tougher than the other, although it kind of sounds like a lot of ballyhoo or, what certain people overall may say, a whole bunch of horse shit. A lot of that is very important in fighting, especially when you're an undefeated fighter still. And Daniel Dubois, especially in this instance, it is a little bit important, at least as a factor in this fight, because Daniel Dubois and Fabio Wardley has kind of alluded to this multiple times, and he's not the only one that Daniel Dubois does seem to have a little bit of quit in him. And I'm not someone that, overall likes to state that someone overall, has, a certain amount of quit in them because, boxers are boxers. It takes a certain amount of courage and dedication and discipline to get inside that ring. But there are certain people, in my personal view, that when you take a look at, yes, you can point to them and call them quitters. And Daniel Dubois is unfortunately one of those fighters, at least in my personal view. When you talk about certain fighters that I've seen quit in a fight, you're talking about Roberto Duran in the No Mas rematch against Sugar Ray Leonard, I believe all the way back in the 80s. You're talking about Guillermo Rigondeaux against Vasyl Lomachenko, claiming that he had a broken hand. There was, just in my personal view, there was no way that he had an actual broken hand because he wasn't ever landing anything. There was no way that it was impossible. Basically, Guillermo Rigondeaux was so extraordinarily skilled overall. But when he finally stepped into a ring who could actually match him, or someone that actually knew how to counter him, and of course Lomachenko was, obviously at least a weight class or two bigger than that of a Guillermo Rigondeaux. But the point overall is that, it should have not been at least as much of a problem as what it was, at least for Guillermo Rigondeaux to not even land a single punch. I mean, I don't remember Rigondeaux landing a single punch. But anyways, the point is that that was an instance to where he quit because he could have took more damage in my personal view, or at least went out, kind of shooting bullets, as they would quote unquote say. And Daniel Dubois, in my personal view, there has been a couple times where I've seen that with him as well, especially in both Alexander Usyk fights. Now, I'm not going to judge him, very harshly for that of the Joe Joyce loss early on in his career, because both of those guys were undefeated fighters. And of course, Daniel Dubois was still learning as a fighter, A. And on top of that, I believe that it was medically reported that he broke his orbital eye bone. But that being stated, I do not remember any massive injuries that Daniel Dubois had suffered to the point to where he cannot get back up in either Alexander Usyk fight. And it had appeared, especially in the rematch, that when Alexander Usyk knocked him down with that overhand left, Daniel Dubois at around the 9 or 10 count got straight back up. So the point overall is that Fabio Wardley, without a doubt, more than likely in his mind, and I believe that he's alluded to this a couple of times, he realizes that Daniel Dubois has a little bit of quit in him. And the last time that Daniel Dubois did end up fighting was against that of an Alexander Usyk. Now, the reason why this is so very particularly interesting is because you don't really exactly know where Daniel Dubois is going to be coming from in this fight. Does he believe overall that he has a 50-50 level chance to, beat that of a Fabio Wardley? I think more than likely that he does. But I also think that he realizes that Fabio Wardley is a very, very dangerous opponent and someone that he has to take very seriously. I do think that Daniel Dubois may be a slight bit nervous for this fight, because if he does end up losing this fight, he's pretty much going to go back down to the totem pole and be somewhat forgotten, at least for that, until he can build himself back up, if that's even possible to do so. Because suffering a knockout loss to Alexander Usyk and suffering more than likely the damage that would probably happen, in this fight if he were to lose to that of a Fabio Wardley, it's not going to be easy to recover from, at least in my personal view. But we'll overall continue on, overall. But that is kind of one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because as I stated, I was going to talk about both the strengths and the weaknesses of both fighters. Well, I have no doubt about it in my mind that Fabio Wardley, being the undefeated fighter and being someone that at least I've never seen being knocked down before, and on top of that, someone that has been down several rounds before in multiple fights against Joseph Parker and also against Justice Hooney, and for him to come back and actually get the stoppage against both of those guys. Now, excuse me. Now, against Joseph Parker, I've already kind of stated this. I kind of thought that there was a little bit of hometown cooking there. I kind of thought that the referee, who was known for stopping fights way too prematurely, they kind of picked him on purpose. And I believe that one of the judges even had Fabio Wardley ahead on the scorecards. So it was fairly obvious that, just in my personal view, that they were trying to give Fabio Wardley a little bit of an edge in that fight. But that doesn't really surprise me that much, because oftentimes British fighters, they can be looked at as the A side. When you're talking about, sports in general, if you're fighting a nation or if you're fighting a team, or someone overall that comes from the quote unquote, overall royale, overall type of territory, you have to be very careful. If you're an NFL team and if you're facing a team like the San Francisco 49ers, the Dallas Cowboys, the Green Bay Packers, the New York Giants, something like that, you have to be very careful, because more than likely the referees are going to give them somewhat of favored calls. And I understand overall that certain people may say, what are you talking about, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, certain franchises, certain teams, and also certain fighters earn the all-around league or earn the all-around sport a little bit more money. So at the end of the day, whether people want to believe it or not, they say, listen, if you help us out, if you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours. And if you end up doing this, in the long run, it's going to be greater for everybody, including you. Because if you overall help us out, if you maybe stop the fight, overall a little bit early, or make it look, like a relatively competent stoppage, then overall we could put an extra couple zeros, on that check that you're about to get from us. And on top of that, we can give you, overall more, exposure within that of the boxing world. You can, headline more of our main events. That's basically what they do. And certain people, may not believe that. But yes, there are certain referees that do that. It is what it is, and it happens in every single sport. So that's why Daniel Dubois, excuse me, in my view, he's going to have to be very careful within this fight, because I have no doubt about it in my mind that more than likely that if it does end up going to the scorecards, not that they're necessarily going to rob that of a Daniel Dubois, but if the fight is very, very close, I will not be surprised if they give it to Fabio Wardley, even if it's a little bit by hook or by crook, just in my personal view. Now, I'm not going to try to plant that in a lot of people's minds. I do think that Daniel Dubois may have to be a little bit careful of that, because they do want that Alexander Usyk versus Fabio Wardley fight, because that is the fight that a lot of people want to see, because Wardley is undefeated, and no one truly wants to see Daniel Dubois versus Alexander Usyk on a third occasion. But that overall being stated, once again, heading into their strengths and weaknesses, let's now get in, overall to the meat and the potatoes of what both fighters bring in terms of skill sets and who I believe overall is mainly going to win the fight. If you're asking me who I believe is going to win the fight, I do believe that Fabio Wardley more than likely is going to win the fight. But I would not be surprised at all if Danny Dubois, were to end up winning this fight. I would not be, because I think that both fighters can possibly do something that the other fighter may not particularly react very well in. I think Fabio Wardley is someone that has the better upper body movement to a slight degree. I think that he's someone that, overall moves his head to a better degree. I think Danny Dubois, although not necessarily having the crispest, of feet or necessarily the crispiest of punches, he is someone overall that does have a higher level of pace than that of a Fabio Wardley. One thing I've noticed about Fabio Wardley, although, he can be a relatively good counterpuncher, although he's someone that is very dangerous, can kind of punch over the top of a jab, especially with that great right hand that he has. Sometimes he just lets opponents just control the pace way too much. And I think that sometimes he also throws way too much power in a lot of his shots in the early part of the fight, which means that if you're doing that, then you're not really controlling the pace and you're not really pacing yourself. And if you're doing that, all that means is that you're tiring yourself out. And we've seen Fabio Wardley do this in several of his fights. I've seen this against Frazier Clark, I've seen it against Justice Hooney, and I've also seen it against Joseph Parker. There will be several rounds, kind of from almost rounds 3, or rounds, 4, pretty much all the way from about round 9 to round 10, where Fabio Wardley will kind of be a little bit gassed, but because he can kind of take those rounds off, and on top of that, he's a bigger guy and he has a whole lot of power, Fabio Wardley overall can, kind of come back. Fabio Wardley is almost the better and more technical version and the British version of a Deontay Wilder. He's someone overall that can be behind several rounds, but if he lands that good right hand or a good solid punch, he can potentially knock you out, and he's someone that is more technically sound than that of a Deontay Wilder. Now, is he as physically imposing as a Deontay Wilder? Does he have as much power as him, in my personal view? Probably not. Is he someone that is, quite as dangerous, with Wilder standing at about 6'7", and having about an 83-inch arm reach? No, probably not. But the point overall is that Fabio Wardley is a very, very dangerous contender. And of course, now he's not only a contender in this fight, he is now the WBO heavyweight world champion. So this is going to be a very particularly interesting fight. And Daniel Dubois is going to have to watch out for that one too. Because one of the punches that Fabio Wardley really loves to throw, as well as that of a Daniel Dubois, by the way, is that of the right hand or the right cross or the overhand right over the top of that jab. Now, the thing is that both fighters do is that they both kind of know how to do this. And it's going to be very interesting to see who can kind of utilize this a little bit more, because Fabio Wardley, he also gets hit by that right, over the jab a little bit more as well. Because kind of like what we've seen with Nakatani and Inoue, excuse me, Nakatani against Inoue, he was having that lead hand out there kind of as a probing jab, but kind of like I predicted, he at times can kind of leave it out there a little bit too long without reacting in the correct way. Fabio Wardley does the same thing. He'll kind of leave his lead hand out there, but he leaves it out there a little bit too long, and sometimes within that of the, the wrong range without kind of doing anything with it, to the point overall to where it can get easily countered over the top. And I've seen this overall against Joseph Parker. I also seen it against Clark. I also seen it against that, overall of a Justice Hooney. He needs to be very careful. And another part of the fight that I'm going to be very interested in is also what happens on the inside. Because Fabio Wardley, after those first few rounds, usually he ends up getting a little bit gassed, at least from what I've seen. To be quite honest with you, the only fight that I really remember Fabio Wardley really pacing himself very well was that of the David Adelaide fight. And Adelaide is someone that has probably one of the worst gas tanks in all of boxing, for his level of talent. So, I mean, it just is what it is. But Fabio Wardley is going to be very interesting to see how he kind of reacts to that of a Daniel Dubois, if Daniel Dubois is just going to come forward at him the whole entire time. And there's no doubt in my mind that Daniel Dubois is definitely here to bring the pain, with those hands. He's here to bring dynamite, pun intended. Of course, for those of you that don't know, Daniel's nickname is that of, DDD, Daniel Dynamite Dubois. But that overall being stated, Daniel Dubois apparently has come in at his heaviest weight that he's ever been. I believe that he's usually around, 240, 243. But this fight, he's around 250. So he didn't gain that much more weight, but he did gain, a good maybe 7 to 10 pounds, which could potentially add a little bit more power, in his step. And it'll be very interesting because Daniel Dubois,
And there's a lot of people asking the question, who do you believe, is the more powerful puncher between the two? I personally believe that Daniel Dubois is the more explosive puncher of the two. Now, I think that Fabio Wardley in certain areas is a little bit more technical, but I don't think that their level of technique, is quite as far apart as many people would try to think. I think Fabio Wardley, with his upper body movement, looks a little bit better on the surface, but sometimes, like I said, he does not know how to pace himself, and he just leaves things out there for too long. And there's also been a few fights where once a fighter really tries to take him, on the inside, he doesn't really know quite really what to do on the inside. I think he's very good in the mid range. I think that he's somewhat good in the long range, but even there, he kind of gets hit a little bit too often. Danny Dubois is someone that I will state that, in my personal view, at least if he is at his best, if this is the Danny Dubois from the Filip Perkovic fight or from the AJ Anthony Joshua fight, Danny Dubois knows how to put on the pace. And he's someone that definitely throws a decent amount more punches than that of a Fabio Wardley, at least when we talk about that of the rate of the rounds. So it's going to be interesting to see how Wardley, how he handles that. If Danny Dubois is able to last within that of the middle rounds, this could be a very, very dangerous fight. Because although Fabio Wardley has lasted against other guys like Justice Hooney and also against other guys like that of Joseph Parker, those aren't just guys overall that are just going to try to knock your block off. Justice Hooney, from what I've seen, at least from that fight, he did, kind of brawl a little bit with, Fabio Wardley, or maybe not brawl, but just try to beat him up on the inside. But it's not like I think he did it in an Ajit Cabello type of style. He still moved off. He still would move around a little bit, kind of, set him up for traps and, get him on the inside quite a bit. And he did a very great job, of course, until Fabio Wardley landed that right hand in the 10th round and, ended up, of course, getting him. And he was several rounds down. I believe. I don't know what the scorecards read, but, overall, basically, for anyone who watched that fight, he pretty much lost every single round, if not absolutely losing every single round after that of the second or third round. So, once again, Fabio Wardley is dangerous at every moment in the fight, but I don't know if he's ever fought a puncher and also someone that's going to put on the pace, on him quite as much as what a Danny Dubois, potentially could do. Now, the question, of course, is Danny Dubois actually going to put on that level of pace? Because I don't know where he's going to be at necessarily mentally after that Alexander Usyk loss. And another question that I also have is what is going to happen if Fabio Wardley hits him early? Because although Fabio Wardley definitely can get a knockout late in this fight, he very well just as easy could get a knockout early on in this fight. Both of these guys have the potential to knock each other out early. Excuse me. And there was a comparison, I believe in one of the videos that actually was the perfect comparison for this fight. They compared it to that of a George Foreman versus that of a Ron Lyle. And I think overall that probably is the perfect comparison. Because for those of you that don't, remember Ron Lyle or overall, know him as a fighter, he was someone that I believe never became a champion, during that era. Of course, that was when there was less belts during the Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, Joe Frazier era. But that overall being stated, Ron Lyle was looked at as a very tough competitor. He was someone that was looked at as a mean and, very rough dude. He was very physically talented. He could punch like a horse kicks. He was someone overall that was very tough. And him and George Foreman had an absolute war. That probably is the perfect type of comparison for this fight because neither of those fighters were ever going to be the best heavyweight in the world, at least when you talk about their skill set. Now, certain people, of course, may kind of look at me a little bit sideways or funny when I mention George Foreman, but no, George Foreman was never the most skilled fighter, on the planet, and he'll even tell you that himself. That's why whenever he fought a guy like Muhammad Ali or, even a couple of other boxers in his career, he would usually get outboxed because George Foreman was someone overall that pretty much had a plan A, but if you were able to get past his size and his level of power and, some of the attacks that he was able to get, he really didn't have any plans after that. That's pretty much what George Foreman was. Now, Fabio Wardley, in my view, is a little bit more multidimensional, perhaps, but Danny Dubois, and maybe a little bit, but, they're not the most multidimensional fighters. They're fighters overall that, overall pretty much they know what they want to do. Fabio Wardley is going to want to fight more within that of the mid range. He does want to get up close and personal with you and kind of try to bully you a little bit, not necessarily in the same way that a Mike Tyson would, or say, in current days, I don't know, maybe like that of an Ajit Cabello would, but he is going to try, to pace you, try to get you a little bit slowly. He's going to work in bursts, maybe with uppercuts to the body, hooks upstairs, overall, and especially that 1-2 upstairs. But that overall being stated, once again, the reason why this fight is going to be so very particularly interesting is because Daniel Dubois, one thing that he learned within that of the past few fights is how to punch in between the shots, especially within that of the mid range. Now, excuse me, is it, in beautiful fashion, like you would see overall like that of an Evander Holyfield or a Muhammad Ali or something like that? No, not necessarily. But Daniel Dubois has learned how to use his size, he's learned how to use his reach, and he's learned how to use his level of power. And I'm going to be very interested to see how Fabio Wardley is able to handle that level of power if it ends up hitting him consistently. Because if Daniel Dubois overall ends up, let's say even losing the first 2 rounds, kind of like what he did against Filip Hrgovic, overall, and then kind of coming on strong within that of the next few rounds, and it starts to get to the middle rounds, and Daniel Dubois is still coming on strong and hurting him badly, especially if he knocks Fabio Wardley down once, or twice. I'm not really quite sure if Fabio Wardley is going to be able to recover in this fight. And the reason why I claim that is because, Daniel Dubois, he is a huge puncher. And he's someone that, although he may not get enough credit for it, Daniel Dubois actually does not have as bad a stamina as what some people give him, kind of blame for. I don't think that he has the best of chins. I don't think that he moves his head off the center line well. And I think that, he keeps his hands down a bit too low, as well as does, Fabio Wardley, although his right hand is more within the vicinity of his face at times, But that also being stated, this brings me to my next point. Fabio Wardley may have the slight better upper body movement, but I don't know if it's to an elite enough degree to where he's just going to dominate this fight. And that kind of brings me back to the point of, to where I just really don't know 100% who to pick in this fight. I am going with Fabio Wardley because he's the undefeated fighter, and he has shown me that he can come back in a fight. But this is potentially going to be the biggest fight in his career, and of course his last one was pretty big when he beat, Joseph Parker, who hadn't lost for a few years. But this fight right here, I believe personally, just in my view, is probably going to be the biggest challenge, at least if Daniel Dubois really comes to play. Because one thing I'll give Daniel Dubois is this. I don't think that he's someone that has the best feet that I've ever seen, and he definitely does not have the best upper body movement that I've ever seen. But he has a little bit more wiggle and a little bit more rhythm than what people give him credit for. And he does know how to counter, a jab to a certain degree. I've seen it against Filip Hrgovic. He also has a great overhand right. He has some great hooks, and he's someone that he will, once he gets on the inside, punish you to the body and also up top. And that is, really, to be quite honest with you, a lot of Fabio Wardley's weakness. Not only is he very vulnerable to that right over the top of his jab, but if he misses a shot or overextends, Daniel Dubois is very good at returning fire, kind of backing up a little bit, and then, making them pay, with their misses and just launching it either to the body or launching it up top. And I don't think Fabio Wardley is a super great defensive fighter. I've seen this fight against Justice Hooney. I've seen this fight against, Frazier Clark. And I've seen this fight, overall against a couple of other guys. He is not a super defensively responsible fighter. So at first, I kind of wanted to predict Daniel Dubois in this fight. I mean, it's really a fight that could go either way, but I just don't know how Daniel Dubois is going to react when Fabio Wardley hits him in the early part of the fight. And if you ask me who I believe is going to get hit first, I do believe more than likely that is going to be Daniel Dubois. If you ask me who I think is going to get hit with a major shot, first, I think more than likely it's going to be Daniel Dubois. And I want to see how he reacts to that. Now, I think that Dubois will probably go through it a little bit. But, another reason why I'm also picking Wardley is because I do believe that he has the better chin. And I think that there's a possibility that, he can hit Dubois because Dubois is not quite as maneuverable, at least with his upper body movement, as that of a Joseph Parker or as a Justice Hooney. Those guys actually change levels to a degree and would move their head off the center line, consistently. I'm not quite sure, if Daniel Dubois has ever really learned how to do that, at least to a consistent degree. Now, he does it to a slight better degree than what certain people may give him credit for, but he still gets hit way too much. For those of you overall that, ended up watching this fight against that of a Filip Hrgovic, Hrgovic was landing that one too, like, basically throughout the whole entire fight. Even when Hrgovic, when he really started tiring out, in the second half of that fight, as long as it lasted. And Hrgovic is someone that's relatively talented, but in my view has been a bit overrated, over recent years. He's someone that, overall does not have great conditioning. He does not move nor change levels, overall good enough. He does not move his head off the center line well at all. And he's someone overall that keeps his hands down a little bit too low. And a part of the reason, I read the comment section, a lot of people thought that Danny Dubois kind of used his head a little bit too much in that fight. And I agree, he definitely did. But I also thought that Danny Dubois landed a lot of good counters in that fight. And I also thought that he was just a better man in that fight. Because Filip Perkovic just really did not know what to do once Danny Dubois really got within range. And I do have to wonder, will that be Fabio Wardley within this fight? Well, I'll assume that Fabio Wardley is a slight bit better than that of a Filip Perkovic, but I could be completely wrong. To be fair, Wardley has been down several rounds against that of a Justice Huni, and on top of that, he was down by at least a few rounds, in my personal view, by that of a Joseph Parker. So we'll see. I know that Fabio Wardley, overall states that he can end the fight at any given moment in time, and that's very true. But it's also very, potentially possible that so can Daniel Dubois, But we'll see what ends up happening here. That being stated, overall, just to talk about it, Daniel Dubois, I believe, although both of them kind of have clunky feet, Daniel Dubois knows how to use his feet to move in and outside of the range, in my personal view, a little bit more. And when you also talk about their jab, Fabio Wardley might have the more technical, better jab, at least in terms of the looks department, but I don't know how useful it's going to be if he does not throw it consistently. Now, I do think that, overall that he'll throw it, enough in order to win the fight, but he needs to be very careful because, like I said, Wardley sometimes will just take too many rounds off and he lets his opponent control the pace, and I don't know if he can do that against an opponent like this. So we'll see overall, once again, what ends up happening there. But anyways, that being stated overall, the use of Danny Dubois' feet, if you actually take a look at him in the Filip Perkovic fight and also in the AJ Anthony Joshua fight, although AJ, to be fair, looked like a complete corpse of what he used to be. But that being stated, Danny Dubois actually knows how to use his feet to a better degree than that of a Fabio Wardley. His upper body is very stiff, and Fabio can be as well. But the feet-wise, overall, Danny Dubois at least knows how to move in and outside of the range to land a jab, to land a good 1-2, and then to make him pay on the inside. So I'm going to be very interested to see how Fabio Wardley ends up adjusting within that, of this fight. It's going to be very, very particularly interesting. And to me, it really is a 50-50 level fight. And I have to give them both a lot of credit. Now, once again, what are the strengths and the weaknesses of both fighters? I think that Danny Dubois, ups him in the pace. I think that he's someone that is the more powerful puncher. He is someone that, in my view, uses his feet to a better degree. But what are Fabio Wardley's, advantages? He is someone that, A, is the undefeated fighter. He does not have quit in him, at least from what we've seen so far. He's someone that has the better chin. I would debate that he maybe has the better jab. Although Danny Dubois, to be fair, he may throw it a decent amount more. So in order for the jab to be as effective as what it needs to be, he is going to have to throw it consistently. That is one thing that Wardley's going to have to do in this fight. But we'll see what ends up happening. That being stated, Wardley, in my view, does have the better upper body movement. And he's someone overall that also has power, and he has the better chin. Now, certain people may take a look at it and say, well, that doesn't really sound enough, in order for a fighter to really win the fight. Because a lot of the skills you kind of put in Danny Dubois' corner. Well, there are certain skills I think that both men have over the other. A lot of the skills, I think that Danny Dubois, or advantages that Danny Dubois has over Wardley, are physical, especially in terms of stamina or strength when it comes to that, or at least, punching power. But that being stated, there are certain skills, even, in their boxing styles that one has over the other. Like I said, I think that Wardley has the better upper body movement, but he's going to have to use it a bit more consistently in this fight, because if he keeps getting hit consistently in this fight, he's probably not going to last all 12. He's probably going to get, if Dubois looks anything like what he did in the Hrgovic fight, and if it's, if it plays out like that, Woodley's probably going to get knocked out anywhere from round 7 or round 9. It's not going to last all 12. That being stated, overall, Woodley, I do believe, does have the slight better jab, at least in terms of technical jab work. It is a debate in my view, because Danny Dubois does use his jab a little bit more, so we'll see how Wardley reacts to that. But I think that Wardley overall, with him having the better chin, with him overall being the undefeated fighter, and also with him having the slight better upper body movement, that he may just have the slight advantage in this fight. But this is really a fight that really is a coin toss. And to be quite honest with you, one of the big part of the reasons why I'm kind of going with Wardley in this fight is because overall he's shown me that, he has such great heart and that he has such great determination. And on top of that, I don't know how Danny Dubois is going to come back from that loss of Mr. Alexander Usyk. But we'll see. Because if this was the same Danny Dubois that held the title, I'm not quite sure if Fabio Wardley would defeat that Daniel Dubois. But we'll see overall once again what ends up happening there. But, unfortunately, that's pretty much about it for this breakdown. I did want to give you guys a little bit of a better breakdown, but unfortunately, my video, ended up getting, blocked overall because of copyright reasons. But I thought that I would kind of give you just a little bit of a quick fire prediction, and that pretty much is about it for today. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you later, and we'll see where this fight goes because this is going to be a terrific fight. But anyways, that's about it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later.